All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you all for taking the time to join us tonight for our first speaker series of the new year. I know that after the holidays, it can be kind of weird, a weird sort of hangover feeling just from all of the whirlwind of family and travel and all of that. So we really appreciate you guys joining us for the first week of the new year. Before we go ahead and get started, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that here in Southern Nevada and in Reno, where our speaker is located, we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Southern Paiute or Nuwu people, the Northern Paiute or Numu people, and the Washoe people. What is now called Nevada is home to 27 federally recognized tribes of indigenous peoples. These people are the original stewards of the land and continue to care for our precious natural places to this day. I'd like to invite you to take a moment to consider the legacies of colonization and how they have brought you here today. And with that, I am Clarice Wheeler, and I'll be hosting tonight. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Southern Nevada Programs Coordinator here at Friends of Nevada Wilderness. Friends of Nevada Wilderness is a 501c nonprofit focused on protecting wildlands. Wilderness areas are natural landscapes that are largely unaffected by people. We protect these lands by advocating for the designation of wilderness, educating through avenues such as talks just like this and through outreach in our communities. And then we steward, because lands cannot protect themselves. We work with volunteers on the ground to monitor, restore, and improve access to the special places. I would also like to make just a few announcements. First is that our alternative spring break season has officially begun. If you know any college-age folks who would be interested in dedicating their spring break to stewardship out at Gold Butte National Monument here in Southern Nevada, go ahead and send them our way. I'm going to drop the link to the, where's the chat? There it is. I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to the ASB page in the chat right here so everybody can take a look if they're interested. And then also our 2022 Wild Nevada calendars will officially go on sale for $10 beginning on Monday. So I'll put a link to that in our thank you email as well. We hold this Wild Speaker Series every first Thursday of the month by hosting a local environmental expert for people who are interested in learning more about the outdoors and ways to get involved with conservation efforts. So tonight we are joined by Nevada Wildlife Federation's Executive Director, Russell Kuhlman. The Nevada Wildlife Federation is the oldest statewide conservation organization dedicated to sustaining Nevada's wildlife through conservation efforts and education. So tonight we'll be discussing one of the issues that the Federation has put a lot of effort into recently, which is oil and gas reform and their impacts on our most precious places in Nevada, including and especially the Ruby Mountains. So a little bit of housekeeping notes before we jump in. Make sure to have yourself on mute unless you're speaking. And if we start to have any bandwidth issues, I'll turn everybody's cameras off so that the speaker can come through clearly. Go ahead and drop your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end. And then I believe Russell will also have a few questions throughout, and you can interact via the chat as well. And with that, I'll pass it off to you, Russell.
Thank you. Well, first, thanks for having me here. Like I said, I'm Russell Kuhlman, the Executive Director for the Nevada Wildlife Federation, and I want to kick this off first by sharing my screen. But I just completed a video about Ruby Mountains and oil and gas lease that is going to be shared for the first time ever with you all. So we can start with that right now. So the Ruby Mountains are kind of the secret jewel of the state. If you're an outdoors person, you are missing out if you haven't enjoyed the Ruby Mountains. We have over 10,000 foot granite peaks here, alpine lakes, and that's why they're such a big magnet for different outdoor activities, anything from mountaineering to backcountry skiing, snowboarding, fishing, hiking. There's just something about camping that resets your soul. And that's why it's so important to protect Ruby Mountains from frivolous development like oil and gas leasing that really doesn't belong in an area like this, because outdoor recreation alone provides plenty of value, both monetary and spiritually. Having a place like the Ruby Mountains be able to provide that, that's certainly special enough, in my opinion, to protect it for future generations to enjoy it and have that opportunity to unplug. And essentially my imagination is my own limiting factor on what I can get out of this place. So that video was all shot in the Rubies. Everything that you saw there is within the Ruby Mountains, and really the main goal for that video was just to highlight that outdoor recreation is a very viable option for a lot of those small communities that live around wild areas like the Rubies. And you don't need oil and gas money to have those towns survive. You can get by very easily or have a viable outdoor recreation economy that can support a whole town. And for those that don't know where the Rubies are, that's just south of Elko. And that town is very heavily invested in outdoor recreation, I think because of the Rubies. But right now we're just gonna jump into oil and gas leasing in Nevada, and then I'll touch on the Ruby Mountains Protection Act a little way through here as well. But the first thing I want to talk about is just kind of what we'll go over tonight. I'm going to talk about just general overview, what oil and gas leasing is here in our state. I know before I tackled this issue, I had no idea about any of this and how it worked. So just want to make sure we're all on the same page there before I dive into the Ruby Mountains Protection Act, the Department of Interior Oil and Gas report that you may have heard of, and then Build Back Better plan or act that is currently in Congress, and essentially what this all means for our state. So who manages the public land for oil and gas? How do we lease it? You can't just walk into the BLM office and say, I want to take over this land for development, and who bids on them are going to be some of the things I'm going to go into further detail. So first thing, the BLM owns, or manages, I should say, about 67% of our public land in the state. I think, there's varying estimates, but I've seen upwards to 21% total. That is public land, but without a doubt, BLM manages the good chunk of it at 67%. And that's where most of oil and gas leasing is happening. I haven't seen any oil and gas leasing on Forest Service land to my knowledge, but if there is, it's very, very small. And one of those examples would be some of the land that oil and gas companies are trying to get into the rubies to see what's in there. So the BLM holds these auctions every year, 4 times a year, and they'll put out a release of those areas. And the parcels can vary in size. They could be a couple acres, or they could be upwards of over 2,000 acres per parcel. It just depends. And the potential for oil and gas also depends on these leases. There's no guarantee, or the BLM doesn't put any guaranteed stamp that oil is even going to be there. They could just be completely barren, but no one knows that. So one of the things that is a little weird is actually anyone can nominate a parcel of land for auction. So I could go walk into the office, you could, and just say, I would like this land to be up for the next BLM oil and gas lease auction sale. And that's pretty much it. When the next auction comes up, that land will be available to bid on. And you don't have to be in the oil and gas industry to bid on these parcels. Any individual can do so. A quick little story, last year, actually a person from California bid on a whole bunch of these leases, and she had some ties, I think, to Taiwan. And so she tried to sell them again to Taiwanese investors as kind of like a scam that came out. So that's, obviously one big loophole that hopefully we can close here with some of the bills and plans that are in action. And when you do buy a lease, it is good up to 10 years. So it's a very long time to have a BLM lease sitting there for 10 years and essentially only being invested for energy development, not for habitat restoration or landscape restoration. So one thing I think, or I hope that you get out of this presentation after these next couple slides, is there is very, very, very little oil and gas potential here in the state. When you combine all of the US oil and gas extraction, we are less than 1% of everything produced in the country. This statistic really kind of jumped out at me. 69 of the 22,000 leases sold since 1953 were ever recorded to actually be in areas that produced oil. And out of 1 million acres, over 97% of those roughly 1 million acres currently are just sitting there laying idle. It's really ties up the BLM and kind of handcuffs them from doing a lot of their work that we've all, I'm sure, helped out with personally. However, one of the advantages of having those leases is when development does happen, they have to pay a royalty. So whatever oil they do extract, they have to pay a royalty tax on it that goes back to the taxpayers, which inevitably just goes to the BLM for their funding. But those royalties or rental rates haven't been updated in about 100 years. And if they were just to match inflation, we would have gotten about $50 million over the last 10 years, just charging those oil derricks, which is what the picture is here on the slide, a higher rent, which is not high right now. And between 2016 and 2020, of the lands that were up for auction, only 9 of them sold competitively. So to backtrack a little bit, what the BLM does is they put all of their land up for bidding or for auction, and that's the competitive section. And then whatever land is not bid on goes into non-competitive. which I'll talk about later, but 85% of the parcels that were sold even at the competitive auction were sold at the minimum bid. So there's just not a lot of potential or interest to really produce oil here in Nevada from oil and gas companies. So I mentioned non-competitive leasing. So after it's gone through the auction process, no one's bid on it, it goes to non-competitive, and it's a first come, first serve. But instead of a minimum bid of $2 an acre, you can buy an acre or lease an acre of land for $1.50 an acre. And over the last 10 years, this is how 2 million acres in Nevada were sold. So over 5 million acres of federal land after the 10 years of them not doing anything were terminated without even ever producing oil. So oil companies have leased land, sat on it, kind of restricted the BLM from doing any type of habitat improvement. And after 10 years, the lease is dead, and the BLM missed out on 10 years of doing any type of wildlife landscape improvements on it because it is leased for oil and gas. And once that happens, that's the number one priority for the BLM. So that kind of gets us into speculative leasing. And that is when the oil and gas companies or anyone bidding on them knows that there's very low potential for oil, but they bid on them anyway for various reasons. But throughout the country, 90% of the BLM is available right now for oil and gas leasing, even though 23% is been identified as having moderate to high. So roughly 75% of the land that is up for BLM auction isn't even worth developing on, but that really doesn't stop the oil and gas industries from still purchasing those leases. I don't honestly have a clear answer on why they really invest that much money in areas with low to no potential. That's, I think, something that they keep pretty close to their chest. But again, one potential reason is because it is so cheap. $1.50 an acre to an oil and gas company is pocket change. At least to a lot of them they are. So again, why are these harmful? Because I've gotten that question as well. If they just sit out there, they're not hurting anybody. What's the big deal? Kind of the big deal is, again, when they are sold for oil and gas, BLM is required to kind of have that as their priority. They can't, improve the roads. They can't, build a hiking trail through that property, anything like that, even though they technically still own it. It's leased oil and gas. That's it. That's what it's going to be doing for 10 years. And it really shortchanges the taxpayer because they're still paying very low rental rates. And that could, if those were to be raised, that would be more funding for the BLM to do those activities that we all enjoy on public lands. So personally, I'm more of a visual person. And so if I lost you through those slides, which I can definitely understand what are a little confusing and monotonous, this hopefully will kind of paint the picture I've been trying to get across. So obviously you can see these are Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. The maroon color is areas of identified high potential oil and gas. The red is moderate, and the yellowish tan is low potential. And these are all of the identified oil wells, which it makes sense that the oil wells are all within the high potential. That so far that makes sense to me. However, what really doesn't make sense is I'm going to zoom in on the far left here. So on where the dot is roughly where Ely is. And this maroon area is only one of two in our whole state. The other one's a little bit north of this. But this are all the lease sales, or a chunk of it, not all, in 2019. And you can see that they were still leasing in the high potential areas, but almost 3 times as much in this no man's land, I guess you could call it, this very low to no potential. And again, what my organization does, the Nevada Wildlife Federation, is we kind of keep an eye on all of this, and we look at this area here in the low to no potential and see what type of wildlife depends on that landscape. And this is a very color-rich map, but it's all that color is various degrees of sage grouse habitat suitability. And the dark purple is some of the highest priority for sage grouse. And all of these lease sales that were in the low to no potential area are in high valued sage grouse habitat. And that's where I kind of get my feathers ruffled. And if that happens throughout the state, that's when we write letters to the BLM suggesting that they don't hold those lease sales there because of sage grouse, mule deer, antelope corridors, bighorn sheep habitat. And these areas down here, remember, this was the lower part was the high potential. There really is no, it's very low wildlife habitat value. And so this is kind of the sweet spot. It's high potential for oil, very low wildlife habitat. So we really don't have a problem with this from our organization. It's the one up here that's in prime sage grouse habitat and in low potential. That's where I think our fight is. So hopefully seeing that kind of presented in a clear picture. So what are we doing to stop all of this? Well, Senator Cortez Masto introduced a bill last Congress, or this Congress, that would prohibit all leasing on lands that have been identified by the BLM to have low or no oil and gas potential, which is great news. And this is going to be great for the BLM, so they can stop, in my mind, wasting time to go out to these areas just to say there's no gas here and come all the way back. That takes up their time, their funding, and has very little return in the long run. BLM staff is very much always in a low funding, low staff situation, and I think their time can be better served not going out there and identifying for the 15th time that there's no oil in these leases. So then we also have the Fair Returns for Public Lands Act, which was introduced by our other senator, Senator Jackie Rosen, as well as she introduced it in this Congress as well. And this would, in a nutshell, kind of require anyone investing in oil and gas development to put more money behind their actions. Right now, it's so cheap to lease oil and gas, or at least tie up these acres of land, of public land, that it's not really worth it to them. So since they haven't been updated in 100 years, if you increase the rental rates, the royalty rates, and just the general cost of doing business on our public lands, that potentially could fill the coffers of the BLM or any land managing agency that does oil and gas leasing. I think that's a win-win. All right, is there any questions right now before I keep going, or do you just want to save all the questions to the end? I've kind of whizzed by some stuff, but I'm going to talk about the Ruby Mountains next, which hopefully we've all got to experience at least once. I know it was my first year going out this year there, and I am definitely going to try to do an annual summer trip there, because I feel like I barely tapped into what all of that area has to offer. And I certainly want to see a Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep and mountain goat on some of those alpine lakes while I'm fly fishing, because I believe it's the only place we do have mountain goats in our state, and I think it's the only place in the country that you can see a Himalayan snowcock, which is definitely one of my lifeless birds there. But a cool little fact I didn't know until doing this presentation, that the Ruby Mountains Wilderness Area was protected under the Nevada Wilderness Protection Act of 1989, which the Friends group had very much to do with that. So appreciate all of that work that you did way back then when I was 4 years old, I think. So we could talk all day on why the Ruby Mountains are important, but they also, some top line items is it's the largest mule deer herd in our state. And even though our mule deer herd is really declining throughout Nevada, I think it makes it that much more important to protect everything in the Rubies if it is capable of being the largest herd in the state. And it's one of the most documented and researched migration corridors for mule deer in the country. The science is going back, I think, into the 60s or 70s with how deer use that landscape and in summer in the high alpine and travel down into the winter into the sagebrush flats. But it also feeds the Humboldt River and the Ruby Marshes. And there's a lot of native Lehockton cutthroat trout that rely on that snow melt in all those mountain streams and alpine lakes. So obviously a very important place for our wildlife here in the state. So the Ruby Mountains Protection Act has been around at least 2 or 3 years now, but it was reintroduced 2 Congresses ago. In the 116th Congress, Senator Cortez Masto introduced it and it almost passed, but it failed by 1 vote from a senator from Utah, and that is the only reason why it failed. So we are trying to avoid that happening again, but both senators support it, and it was also introduced by Congressman Mark Amodei in his public lands package in the House. So everyone in the district, in the federal side of it, is supportive of the Ruby Mountains Protection Act, which is great. And this essentially would just ban or prohibit all oil and gas leasing in the Ruby Mountains, but also the Ruby Marshes, the National Wildlife Refuge, which started becoming a worry recently because of some interest that was being shown to develop that area. And if it's passed into law, it only is going to affect oil and gas development. Mining will still be included, as well as any outdoor activities. You can still go camping and hiking and hunting and fishing. It's just specifically to prohibit oil and gas development and leasing. And as I mentioned, on the federal side, it has broad support, and it has broad support all the way down. Everyone's been included in this, which is great. There's a sportsman's for the Rubies, and that includes, to my knowledge, 15 sporting groups that Nevada Wildlife Federation is also a part of, that is really the talking voice for the Ruby Mountains Protection Act. But everyone we've talked to, very little pushback from this bill within Nevada. Again, there was the senator from Utah who wasn't a big fan of public lands and saw this as a public lands overreach grab, but I don't think he had all of the knowledge, in my opinion, of exactly what this was. Again, however, the downside is it's looking like it's kind of stalling out in this Congress because of other priorities that Congress is working on, but the last update that I received is it left the Committee of Energy and Natural Resources, which is kind of that final step before it goes to the floor for a vote. I just haven't received any word or even a general direction of when that vote might take place because of everything that Washington is doing right now. The perfect segue into what Washington is doing right now. When President Biden took office, one of his first things he did was pause all the oil and gas lease sales. Companies could still extract oil if they had a current lease, and whatever leases they bought were still active, which were, I think, 4 million acres of land they haven't even touched yet to develop on. They just couldn't buy any more leases. That was a pretty big pushback, but the reason he did that is so it gave the Department of Interior time to create this oil and gas report to see what loopholes could be closed and kind of walk back maybe some of the steps that the prior administration took, because the prior administration was really all for oil and gas on BLM land, and that was not part of Biden's agenda or plan. So he wanted to kind of put a finger in the fire hose, so to speak, and try to slow it down. Obviously, that received a lot of pushback, but the report was supposed to be released in the summer. However, the day after Thanksgiving, it was actually released, and it highlighted a lot of what we kind of already knew, which was oil and gas lease system is very inadequate when it comes to environmental harms, and oil and gas leasing companies definitely get off the hook big time after they're done extracting oil or gas. Abandoned wells are a problem throughout the West, leaking wells that emit methane. The list goes on, but it also identified that it kind of fosters this wild speculation of these companies coming in and buying all these leases that they don't have really any use for, but it ties up the BLM from doing anything else, and it's not getting the taxpayers are not getting a fair return on their public lands from these companies using them for resource extraction. So what did it recommend? Basically, it recommended to try to fix those, which, increasing the royalty rates, the minimum bids. This looks all familiar because this is essentially what was in Senator Rosen's Fair Returns for Public Lands Act. And so that was really great to see that overlap. It was very welcome to see a bill that we put together here in Nevada that the Department of Interior agreed 100% on is, yes, this is exactly what needs to happen. And one of the things that recommended that identified is a bidder should be financially or technically qualified to develop leases, and that would stop people that have no business leasing oil and gas from leasing these lands and not knowing what to do with them and just sitting on them. So the White House took all of that DOI report and tried to include it in the Build Back Better Act, which this package is very large. The cost estimate range, I've heard 1.5 trillion to 6 trillion. And right now I'm just going to talk on what passed through the House, because the Senate is in a gridlock with trying to get this into law. So what I'll talk about in the next slides are only going to be what happened in the House side of it, and the goal is to have it pass in the House without any of the conservation aspect taken out of it. So what does this do conservation-wise or climate-wise? It's a huge investment, the biggest investment that's ever been in the history of the world towards climate action. $555 billion is something not to shy away from by any stretch of the imagination. But, it does create jobs. One of the things in there is creating the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is pretty much what it was back in the 40s, and just people, trail crews and people working on habitat, climate actions. So on the ground, this would include building transmission lines for green energy, creating more research for battery storage for that energy, carbon capture, actually building windmills, coastal resistance, which is probably not an issue here in Nevada, but obviously in the coastal states with the hurricanes and everything, definitely need some more infrastructure to help them out. Environmental justice has been identified as a funding opportunity, but I would say the two things we would maybe get excited about is the forest and grassland aspect. I read that as cheatgrass removal. Certainly could probably use less of that on the landscape, especially with some of the fires that have come through. And what we're here to talk about today, which is oil and gas reforms. And so I'll kind of focus in more on the oil and gas reforms here. It increases the royalty rate to 12.5% to 19%. And I think it's worth noting that if you were to lease oil and gas on state land, you're already paying 18, 19, all the way up to 25%. So this isn't a huge shock to a lot of oil and gas companies. In states like Texas, I think their state royalty is 25%. So when I hear oil and gas lobbyists say that this is going to hurt them, public lands are their freebie compared to everywhere else they extract from. They're really getting away pretty good. It would create a fee for methane, and that is the contentious part. If you've heard Senator Joe Manchin in the news quite a bit, this is why. These are the parts that he didn't like, because West Virginia is very much extraction state, and this is where he kind of put his foot down and essentially killed it, because he was the only vote left to get this passed before Christmas, and he voted that he wasn't going to do it. And so if you've heard his name in the news, this is essentially why. And then it would increase the minimum bid from 2 acres to 10. So again, kind of requires these companies to put a little more skin in the game. They can't just throw money to get a whole bunch in return. The analogy I kind of look at it as, when I was a kid, I used to go to those carnivals where they'd have the wall of balloons, and some of the balloons would have glitter in them, and you'd pay, like, I think $2 for a dart, and you throw the dart, and if you hit one of the balloons with glitter, you won the prize. That's essentially how I view oil and gas leasing companies buy land. They don't know where the oil is, so they just buy all these acres and throw darts at it and see if one wins. But I know if I had to pay $10 a dart versus $2 a dart, I'd be a little more focused on, where I was putting my oil and gas wells, which I'd be putting a lot less out there as well. Again, just some more good things. Really what this Build Back Better plan does for oil and gas leasing reforms is just increase everything to fit the 21st century. The last time, the first and only time these monetary rates were established was in the 1920s, and they've been the same since. So that's why you see adjusted for inflation every 4 years, because they haven't been adjusted for inflation for the last 120 years. So these oil and gas companies have been paying the same rates for a long time, and a lot of us in the environmental community feel that they have the funds to pay a little more. And then one of the big things, it reduces the lease period from 10 years to 5 years, which is always great. And again, just some more, it creates a bonding requirement that actually matches what is needed to repair some of these sites. Right now, oil and gas companies are only required to pay a $10,000 bond, and the average cost to clean up an abandoned well is in the hundreds of thousands. And guess who pays that difference? Us. So again, the Build Back Better plan would ensure that the oil and gas companies have to put in a bond that adequately reflects the cleanup costs if anything was to happen, or the disassemble of abandoned wells. And then with the speculative leasing, it will charge kind of a delinquency squatters tax, or however you want to call it. But it just motivates oil and gas companies just not to let things sit out on the landscape. If you're not using it, you're either going to pay a whole bunch for it, or you got to get it off our public lands. And you know, the annual fees as well, you can see that the longer it sits there not doing anything, the higher companies are going to have to pay for it, which hopefully, knock on wood, would deter them from having all these oil derricks rust out on our landscape, because you know, it might make for a good vintage photo, but I certainly do not like seeing the rusted out metal equipment on public lands. So, as I said, it is kind of locked up in the Senate right now. It's pure speculation on what could happen with all of this, but some options that have been mentioned is cutting out the climate environmental side of it and just passing it as a climate bill, killing the whole thing, or passing it within the Department of Interior's annual budget, which Congress has to decide and fight over every year. Just like a defense spending bill, they have to create a Department of Interior bill. And hopefully, if Build Back Better was to fail, we could at least get some of these reforms through the DOI. So obviously, it doesn't mean much if it doesn't mean anything for Nevada. But what this really does mean for Nevada, again, which is what I've set out through the entire presentation, and the one thing I hope we walk away knowing from this is these oil and gas leasing reforms just put more money towards the BLM to accomplish their multi-use land goals. You know, we could sit here and maybe it could be another talk, but we can chat all day about what funding the BLM needs, or what. Well, her horse and burro program can certainly use some attention. Cheatgrass management, mountain biking trails to increase that local economy in places like Ely, which is really starting to become a mountain bike destination. Research for sage grouse, and the list goes on. And the BLM hasn't been getting very far asking directly from Washington, but I think if we were able to pass some of these oil and gas leasing reforms, that's going to be their cash cow, so to speak. And with our help, you know, working with the BLM and getting out there, you know, I think we would be able to really improve our lands for the next generation. And that is it in a nutshell. So I can stop sharing.
Does anybody have any questions for Russell? This is our time now to take questions. Well, I have a question, not directly applicable to oil and gas leasing, but I was curious to know about whether or not that that controversial fee for methane production would also apply to ranching ranching.
Not to my knowledge. I think Manchin had an issue with it just because of all the oil that's coming out of West Virginia and some of the pollution. He's certainly probably the most moderate person in the Senate right now, and he was the one stick in the mud. But that's not the only thing he has an issue with. He obviously has an issue with the overall price tag, but within the climate aspect, it was the methane that he specifically called out as not wanting to be a part of to create that fee for them. But again, you'd probably pay pretty good money to know what's going on in his head, and unfortunately, I do not. So.
I don't know if I want to know. All right. Do we have any other questions? Whether that is unmuting yourself or dropping your question in the chat. Let me check the live really quick. Okay. Doesn't seem like it. Okay. Russell, is there anything that you would like to say to close us out?
No, just, thanks for the invite. Talking for 45 minutes about oil and gas leasing reforms is certainly not the sexiest thing, I think, but hopefully I didn't bore you all too much. And if you're on Facebook, you can find us through there. But I have the website. It's just NV. I can type it in the chat right now, but if you have any questions, all my contact info is there. I'm happy to chat about, oil and gas leasing reforms. We also, some of the other issues that we work on is just general public lands involvement. The desert refuge would fall under that. That's an issue that we work on very closely with the Friends group, and then also wildlife corridors. We were able to get the governor to pass a executive order identifying corridors as important for Nevada Department of Wildlife to work on. So, corridors, oil and gas reform, and then general public lands are definitely our top issues. So if anyone out there has any ideas or wants to chat more about those, feel free to call or email or shoot me a text.
Alrighty, well, on that note, we'll close it out for the evening. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight, and a big thank you to Russell for taking the time out of his Thursday evening to speak with us. Friends of Nevada Wilderness is a membership-based organization. Over 80% of donations we receive go directly to advocating for wilderness protection, restoring habitat for wildlife, maintaining hiking trails. We'd love for you to become a member and join us in keeping Nevada wild and beautiful. Lastly, remember that we hold the Wild Speaker Series every first Thursday of the month with various outdoors topics. So mark your calendars for February 3rd, 2022. We will be continuing our speaker series in person once again for the first time since the pandemic began. And it will be held at the PAD Climbing Center out near Henderson. So I'll have all the details up on our website and our meetup. We'll be joined by Alex Harper from Red Rock Audubon Society for a talk about birding around Southern Nevada. And he will also be talking about some special birding sites at popular climbing destinations to kind of fit in with our new speaker series location. So don't worry if you tune in from non-Southern Nevada locale. I will still be broadcasting the speaker series live on Facebook and probably YouTube, and we'll still be recording and posting the recordings to our YouTube after as well. All right, as always, everybody, thank you once again for joining us, and have a good night.